In autumn 1847, 6 men were sent into the Canadian Arctic to find traces of Franklin's lost expedition. They discovered why 129 sailors never returned. Something in the frozen north had been waiting. Something that walked upright. Something that learned their voices. Before we begin, please subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Thanks. The guide who brought us news of the Franklin expedition's disappearance arrived at Fort William on a morning when the river ice groaned like something alive. He was Cree, older than his years showed, and he refused to speak inside the post. We stood in the wind while he explained that no ships had returned, no men had walked out of the ice, and the last Inuit reports spoke of strange tracks near abandoned campsites far inland. Thomas Hale listened without expression. He was the factor's son, 34, built lean from winter travel and used to making decisions that kept men breathing. The Hudson's Bay Company wanted answers before spring breakup, and Hale had volunteered to lead a small overland party north from the trade routes to search for any trace of Sir John Franklin's lost cruise. The Admiralty in London had sent 2 ships and 129 men into the Arctic 3 years prior. None had emerged. I signed on as clerk and surveyor. My name was William Marsh, 28, trained in Edinburgh for work that required ink and instruments, not snowshoes and frozen fingers. But the pay was steady, and the wilderness had a pull I couldn't name. Hale hired 4 others: George Macready, a Scottish trapper with a scar across his knuckles from a wolf trap; Samuel Croft, a former sailor who knew ice but hated it; Joseph Lund, a young Orkneyman good with dogs and repairs; and Peter Gray, a Métis hunter who spoke 3 languages and watched the tree line more than he watched us. Our Dene guide, a man named Akaicho, agreed to lead us as far as the Barrens, but no farther. He said the land beyond the last trees belonged to something that did not share. When Hale pressed him, Akaicho looked at the sky and said the white men who went that way in ships had woken something old by staying too long in places meant only for passing through. Hale thanked him and added extra tobacco to his payment. We left Fort William in early October with 2 sledges, 8 dogs, and supplies calculated to last 10 weeks if we stretched them. The plan was to follow known trap lines north, then cut east toward the coast where Franklin's ships were last reported. We would search for cairns, graves, abandoned camps, anything that might explain what happened. The company wanted closure. The families in England wanted bodies. The first week brought only routine hardship. Cold that cracked the skin, wind that found every gap in our clothing, and a landscape that stretched flat and white in all directions. The dogs pulled well. The sledges held. We made 15 miles some days, less when the snow drifted deep. At night, we built low shelters from blocks of packed snow and burned what driftwood we could find. Macready told stories. Croft complained about his feet. Lund kept the harnesses in repair. Gray studied our back trail each morning before we moved. On the 8th day, we found the first cairn. It stood on a low ridge overlooking a frozen lake, built from stones that had been carried up from the shoreline. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a note dated 2 years prior. It listed 6 names, all from Franklin's expedition, and stated they were proceeding south on foot after abandoning their ships in the ice. The handwriting was steady. The message ended with coordinates and a direction. Hale copied the note into his journal and resealed the cairn. That night, he spread his map on the sledge and traced a route that would intersect the path Franklin's men had taken. If we pushed hard, we might reach their trail in a week. If they had left more cairns, we might learn how far they got. If they were still alive, we might find them before winter made travel impossible. But Gray was uneasy. He crouched by the fire and poked at the coals without looking up. The snow around that cairn was old, he said. But something had been there recently. The stones at the base were disturbed. Hale asked what kind of animal. Gray shook his head. Not animal tracks, just marks, like something had tested the way to the cairn and then moved on. We followed the coordinates southeast into country that grew rougher. The flat barrens gave way to low hills ribbed with stone and scattered with boulders that jutted from the snow like broken teeth. The light dimmed earlier each day, and the cold deepened until our breath froze in our beards and our eyelashes stuck together when we blinked. The dogs began to falter. One collapsed in harness and refused to rise. Lund examined it and found no injury, just exhaustion and something he couldn't name. The dog's eyes were wide and fixed on the hills behind us. We made camp in the lee of a rock shelf that offered some shelter from the wind. While Croft and McCready built the fire, I climbed the slope to take a sighting with my compass. The needles spun erratically, swinging from north to west and back again without settling. I tapped the glass and waited. The needle finally steadied, but it pointed northeast, toward a gap in the hills that looked darker than the surrounding snow. When I returned to camp, Gray was standing at the edge of the firelight, staring into the dusk. "We're being followed," he said quietly. Hale asked by whom. Gray didn't answer immediately. He pointed to a line of shallow depressions in the snow about 50 yards out, barely visible in the failing light. They ran parallel to our path, then curved away toward the hills. "Those marks weren't there an hour ago," he said, "and they don't match any animal I know." That night, none of us slept well. The wind carried sounds that didn't fit. A distant crack like breaking ice, a low hum that rose and fell, and once a noise that resembled a man calling out in distress. Hale ordered us to keep the fire burning and to stay within sight of its light. He sat with his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond the shelter. Around midnight, the dogs began to whine. They strained at their tethers and pulled toward the sledges, trying to burrow beneath the canvas covers. McCready whispered that he'd heard stories from trappers about things that lived in the deep cold, creatures that followed men and waited for them to weaken. He said the Inuit had words for them, but wouldn't speak the words aloud for fear of drawing their attention. Croft told him to shut up. Gray said nothing, but his hand stayed near his knife. Just before dawn, something moved along the rock shelf above us. We heard the scrape of claws or nails on stone, slow and deliberate, as if whatever made the sound was testing its footing. Hale stood and aimed his rifle at the darkness. "Show yourself," he called. The scraping stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and waiting. Then the sound resumed, farther along the ridge, moving away from us. When first light came, we climbed to the shelf to investigate. The rock was bare except for a thin layer of frost. No tracks, no scat, no sign of any animal. But near the edge, where the shelf dropped into a crevice, we found deep gouges in the stone. 4 parallel lines, each as wide as a finger, carved into the rock as if something had gripped the edge and pulled itself up. The depth of the marks suggested strength beyond any creature we knew. Gray crouched beside the gouges and ran his finger along one of the lines. He looked at Hale. "This is where we should turn back," he said. Hale studied the marks and looked north toward the route Franklin's men had taken. "We have coordinates," he said. "We have a mission. We keep going." We pushed northeast through country that felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The hills closed around us like a fist, and the silence deepened until even our voices seemed to die a few feet from our mouths. The dogs moved slower now, heads down, ears flat. They no longer barked or fought over food. At night, they huddled together and refused to face outward from the fire. On the 11th day, we found the second cairn. It stood in the center of a shallow depression, surrounded by snow that showed no tracks approaching or leaving. The stones were stacked carelessly, as if built in haste. Inside was another note, but this one was different. The handwriting was irregular, the letters cramped and uneven. It listed only 3 names from Franklin's crew, and the message was brief. We saw it watching from the ice ridge. It followed us for 6 days. God help us, it learned our voices. Hale read the note twice before folding it and placing it in his coat. He said nothing. McCready asked what the message meant. Hale told him it meant Franklin's men had been under strain, possibly suffering from exposure or starvation. Rational explanations. But I saw how his eyes moved across the surrounding hills, searching. That afternoon, we came upon the first body. It lay half buried in a drift at the base of a boulder field, frozen in the position of someone who had been crawling. The clothing marked him as one of Franklin's crew. A tattered naval coat with brass buttons, wool trousers torn at the knees, boots wrapped in strips of canvas. His face was turned away from us, pressed into the snow. Hale and Gray rolled the body over. The man's eyes were open, ice-filmed and staring upward. His mouth was open too, locked in an expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite pain. Something else. Recognition, perhaps. His hands were clenched, and when Gray pried the fingers open, we found he'd been gripping a fistful of his own hair. But what stopped us cold was the condition of his back. Through the torn coat, we could see long parallel marks in the flesh, frozen and bloodless. Not claw marks, not blade marks. Something in between. The tears ran from shoulders to waist, deep enough to show bone. Gray examined them without touching and said the wounds were old, days or weeks before death. The man had traveled a long distance after receiving them. We buried him as best we could under stones and moved on. No one spoke about what we'd seen. That night, Croft broke the silence by asking if anyone else had noticed the body's position. He was crawling away from the direction we're heading, Croft said, crawling back the way he came. Hale said that proved nothing. Men suffering from hypothermia often became disoriented. But Lund quietly pointed out that the man's boots showed wear consistent with forward travel, not retreat. He'd been crawling towards something, not away from it. The temperature dropped further. My hands cramped inside my gloves, and the cold worked its way through every layer of clothing until it sat against my skin like a second body made of ice. We rationed our food more carefully now. The dogs ate less. One died in harness during the night, frozen stiff by morning. We left it where it fell. On the 14th day, we found the camp. It sat in a narrow valley between 2 ridges, sheltered from the wind but exposed to the sky. 3 tents remained, collapsed under snow. A fire pit marked the center, long cold. Equipment lay scattered. Tin plates, a broken sextant, coils of rope frozen into hard loops, a Bible with its pages torn out and burned for warmth. Hale ordered us to search the tents carefully. Inside the first, we found 2 more bodies, lying side by side as if they'd simply lain down to rest. Both wore naval uniforms. Both had the same parallel marks across their backs and shoulders. One of them had removed his boots and set them neatly beside his head. His feet were black with frostbite. The second tent held supplies, a few tins of preserved meat, now empty, a leather journal with water-damaged pages, the officer's hat with the brim torn off. Gray found the journal and brought it to Hale. Most of the entries were illegible, the ink smeared and faded. But near the end, one passage remained clear enough to read. The thing came into camp last night. It stood at the edge of the firelight and spoke to us in Lieutenant Morris's voice. Morris has been dead for 3 weeks. McCready made a sound low in his throat and moved closer to the fire. Croft asked if the journal said what happened next. Hale flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank except for the final entry, written in a different hand. It took Simmons while he slept. We heard him scream once. When we looked, his tent was empty. We found him at dawn, 2 miles north, still alive, but unable to speak. He died an hour later. We are leaving this place. We made camp in the same valley that night because darkness came too quickly to travel. No one wanted to sleep in the collapsed tents, so we built our shelter 30 yards upwind and kept the fire burning high. The dogs wouldn't settle. They paced at the end of their tethers and pulled toward the sledges, whining continuously. Lund finally untied them and let them cluster around the fire. They lay with their backs pressed together, ears swiveling toward every sound. Around midnight, I heard my name called from somewhere beyond the firelight. The voice was my own, perfect in tone and inflection, as if I'd somehow stepped outside my body and was calling to myself. I froze. Hale's hand clamped on my shoulder. "Don't answer," he whispered. "Don't even look." The voice called again, closer now. "William, I'm cold. Let me come to the fire." I felt my throat tighten with the urge to respond. The voice knew how I spoke, how I shaped words, even the slight hesitation I had before saying certain sounds. It was me, but it wasn't. Gray stood and picked up a burning branch from the fire. He walked to the edge of the light and held it out. "Show yourself," he said. The voice stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then we heard footsteps in the snow, slow and measured, circling our camp. The steps were wrong. Too evenly spaced, too deliberate, as if whatever made them was thinking carefully about each movement. They completed one full circle around us, then stopped directly behind where Croft sat. We all turned. The darkness there seemed thicker, more solid than elsewhere. Croft's breath came fast and shallow. "It's right there," he whispered. "I can feel it watching." Hale raised his rifle and fired into the dark. The shot cracked loud in the cold air and echoed off the ridges. Nothing fell. No sound of impact. But the sense of presence lifted, and the darkness felt ordinary again. Croft sagged forward, hands shaking. Gray returned to the fire and threw the branch onto the flames. "It's testing us," he said. "Learning which voices work, which names get a response. We don't answer, not to anything, not even if it sounds like one of us." We sat in silence after that, watching the darkness and waiting for dawn. The footsteps did not return, but twice more I heard my name spoken from different directions, each time with slight variations in tone, as if the speaker was practicing. I pressed my hands over my ears and kept my eyes on the fire. Beside me, McCready muttered prayers under his breath. Hale reloaded his rifle and kept it aimed at the dark. When gray light finally came, we found tracks surrounding our camp. They circled us 3 times, each circle closer than the last. The prints were almost human. 5 toes, a heel, an arch. But the toes were too long, the heel too narrow, and the stride between each print measured 7 feet. Near where Croft had been sitting, the tracks stopped. In the snow, pressed deep and clear, was the outline of a hand. It was easily twice the size of mine, with fingers that tapered to points. Gray knelt beside it and studied the print without touching it. "This is what took Simmons," he said. "This is what left the marks on the bodies." Hale looked north, toward the direction Franklin's men had been heading. "Then we know what we're tracking." Gray stood and faced him. "No," he said. "We're not tracking it. It's tracking us. Has been since the first cairn. Maybe longer." We abandoned the search for Franklin's men that morning. Hale didn't announce the decision, but we all understood when he ordered us to turn southwest, back toward the trap lines and Fort William. Self-preservation outweighed duty. Whatever had hunted Franklin's expedition was now hunting us, and the evidence suggested it was patient, intelligent, and utterly relentless. But turning back didn't shake it loose. By noon, Gray spotted movement on a ridge behind us, a dark shape that stood upright, too tall and too thin to be a bear. It didn't follow our exact path, but paralleled it, keeping a constant distance of perhaps half a mile. When we stopped, it stopped. When we moved, it moved. Hale glassed it through his scope but couldn't make out details. "The air's too cold," he said. "Heat shimmer is distorting it." But we all knew that wasn't the problem. The problem was that the thing didn't want to be seen clearly. Not yet. The dogs refused to pull. We had to drag the sledges ourselves, taking turns in pairs while the others kept watch. The work exhausted us quickly in the deep cold. My shoulders burned, my hands went numb despite the gloves, and my breath came in ragged gasps that froze into ice crystals on my scarf. McCready collapsed twice. Croft developed a cough that sounded wet and wrong. Lund said nothing but moved slower each hour, his face gray and his eyes distant. On the 16th day, we found the third body. It lay sprawled across our path, frozen in a position of running. This one wore a Hudson's Bay coat, not a naval uniform. A trapper, perhaps, or a guide from another expedition. His neck was twisted at an impossible angle, and his legs were bent backward at the knees. The body looked arranged, posed deliberately to block our route. When Gray moved it aside, we saw that the man's eyes had been removed with surgical precision, and his mouth was packed with snow. "It's showing us what it can do," Gray said. "It wants us to know." Hale ordered us to move faster, to put distance between ourselves and the body. But the thing on the ridge drew closer. By afternoon, it was only a quarter-mile behind us, and we could see it more clearly now. Tall, perhaps 8 feet, with limbs that bent at odd angles. Its gait was wrong, not a walk, not quite a run, but something that flowed across the snow without seeming to sink into it. And its head, when it turned toward us, appeared too large for its body, crowned with something that might have been antlers or branches or something in between. That night we made no fire. Hale said the light would draw it closer. We huddled together under canvas and took turns on watch. The cold bit through every layer until my bones ached and my teeth chattered uncontrollably. Beside me, McCready whispered that we wouldn't make it back. I told him to shut up and save his breath. He gripped my arm with frozen fingers and said, "It's getting inside my head, William. I can feel it sorting through my memories, looking for the right words to use." Around midnight, Lund started talking in his sleep. At first, the words were nonsense, fragments of Orkney dialect mixed with Cree phrases he must have learned from guides. But then his voice changed. It deepened and slowed until it no longer sounded like him. "So hungry," he said, eyes still closed. so very hungry. Starving men taste of fear. Fear makes the meat tender. Gray slapped him hard across the face. Lund woke with a gasp, confused and terrified. "What did I say?" he asked. No one answered. In the morning, we found that something had approached during the night. Tracks circled our shelter, coming within 10 feet before retreating. But these tracks were different from the ones before. They were human, adult male, wearing boots. They started at the edge of our camp and led northeast, back the way we'd come. Hale followed them for 20 yards before they simply stopped in the middle of unmarked snow, as if the walker had been lifted into the air. "It's creating tracks now," Croft said, voice thin with exhaustion, trying to confuse us, make us think there are other people out here. But Gray shook his head. "It's not trying to confuse us. It's showing us what happened to the men it's already taken. Those are their footsteps after it made them walk." We moved through the day in a state between waking and dreaming. Hunger gnawed at my stomach. We were down to quarter rations now, and the cold made thinking difficult. My mind wandered. I imagined my sister's voice calling me home to Edinburgh. I saw buildings that didn't exist shimmering on the horizon. Once, I was certain I saw a ship's mast rising from the snow ahead. But when we reached the spot, there was nothing. On the 18th day, it took McCready. We were hauling the sledges through a narrow pass between two hills when he simply wasn't there anymore. One moment he was 10 feet behind me, pulling his share of the weight. The next, his ropes went slack, and I turned to find him gone. No tracks led away. No sound had been made. He'd been erased from the world as cleanly as chalk wiped from slate. We searched for an hour, calling his name until Hale ordered us to stop. "It wants us separated," he said. "It's waiting for us to scatter." Gray found McCready's glove lying on the snow where he'd been standing. Inside the glove, pressed into the palm, was a single long black hair, coarse as wire and cold to the touch. We found McCready at dusk. He was 2 miles north of where he'd disappeared, standing upright in the snow with his arms at his sides. As we approached, I thought he was alive. His eyes were open. His posture was natural. But when we reached him, we saw he was frozen solid, his skin white as marble. His mouth was open slightly, and from his throat came a sound, a low clicking, rhythmic and deliberate, like teeth chattering, but slower, more purposeful. Gray circled him carefully. "Don't touch him," he said. But Croft was already reaching out. The moment his hand made contact with McCready's shoulder, the body collapsed into pieces. It broke apart cleanly, geometrically, as if it had been carefully sectioned and then frozen in place. Among the pieces, we found things that didn't belong. Small bones from animals we hadn't seen, scraps of cloth from uniforms that weren't ours, teeth arranged in patterns on the snow. "It's building something," Gray said quietly, "using what it takes." He pointed to the patterns. "These are messages, warnings, territory marks. It's telling other things to stay away because this hunting ground belongs to it." We ran then, not fled. Running implies panic, and what we did was more calculated. We abandoned the sledges, took only what we could carry, and moved as fast as the snow and exhaustion allowed. The thing followed openly now, no longer hiding on distant ridges. It walked 100 yards behind us, matching our pace exactly, neither gaining nor falling back. In the failing light, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was made of hunger given form, impossibly thin, with skin pulled tight over bones that showed through like fence posts under canvas. Its limbs were too long, jointed in too many places, and ended in hands with fingers that dragged on the snow. The head was crowned with antlers that branched and rebrushed like lightning frozen in bone. And its face, God help me, its face was almost human. Eyes that watched with cold intelligence. A mouth that moved constantly, forming words we couldn't hear but somehow understood. We ran through the night. Croft fell behind, and we pulled him forward. Lund's cough grew worse until blood flecked his lips. Gray stayed at the rear, knife drawn, watching the thing that followed. It never hurried. Didn't need to. It knew we'd stop eventually, knew we'd have to rest. And when we did, it would be there. On the 20th day, we reached a frozen river that Hale recognized from the journey out. Fort William is 3 days south, he said, voice cracked and raw. If we can cross the river, we might gain distance. But Gray was staring at the ice. It's too thin, he said. The temperature's been rising. It won't hold our weight. Behind us, the thing emerged from the tree line. It stood at the edge of the forest and tilted its head, studying us. Then it opened its mouth, and from its throat came my father's voice, speaking words my father had said to me the day I left Scotland. You'll come home when you've learned what the world is really made of. I felt tears freeze on my cheeks. The thing stepped onto the ice. Run, Hale said. We ran onto the river, ice groaning beneath our boots. Cracks spider-webbed outward from each footfall. Freezing water welled up through fissures and soaked our feet. Behind us, the thing walked slowly, deliberately, its weight making the ice sing with stress fractures. 20 yards from shore, the ice gave way beneath Croft. He plunged through with a scream, the black water swallowing him instantly. Lund grabbed for him, but missed. We kept running. We had no choice. The thing paused where Croft had fallen, staring down into the hole. Then it stepped around the gap and continued following. We reached the far shore and stumbled into the forest, gasping and frozen and broken. Behind us, the thing stood at the river's edge. It did not cross. It simply watched as we disappeared into the trees. We reached Fort William 4 days later. Only 3 of us. Hale, Gray, and myself. Lund died on the 3rd day, his lungs finally giving out. We buried him in shallow snow and marked the spot with his knife thrust into a tree. At the fort, Hale filed a report stating that the search had been unsuccessful. Franklin's fate remained unknown, and we had lost 4 men to exposure and accident. He never mentioned what followed us. Neither did Gray, neither did I until now. I left the Hudson's Bay Company that spring and returned to Scotland. I took a position teaching mathematics at a school in Aberdeen, far from ice and emptiness. I married, had children, lived an ordinary life. But some nights, when the wind comes from the north and carries the smell of snow, I hear my name called in my own voice. And I know that somewhere in the Arctic, it still hunts. Still follows tracks laid down by desperate men, still learns their voices one by one, adding them to its collection. They never found Franklin's ships. They never found most of his men. The official records blame lead poisoning, starvation, and cold. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps some of them did die that way. But I know what hunts the deep Arctic, in places where winter never truly ends. I know what waits for men who venture too far into the hungry cold. And I know that it remembers us. Hale died 10 years ago, in his sleep, they said. But when they found him, his mouth was open and packed with snow, though his windows were closed and it was summer. Gray disappeared 5 years back, went north on a trapping expedition, and never returned. They found his camp intact, his rifle loaded, his supplies untouched. Just no Gray. Only his tracks leading north, then ending in unmarked snow. I am the last one left, and some nights I swear I hear it outside my window, testing voices, calling names, testing my children's voices now, learning. The Wendigo is patient, and it never forgets.